Boa tarde a todas e a todos. Meu nome é Carlos Milani, sou vice-diretor do IESP e hoje eu tenho o prazer de acolher todos vocês para escutar a professora Lucile Martens. On va passar para a língua inglesa. A professora Lucile Martens poderia fazer a palestra em francês, mas ela gentilmente aceitou fazer a palestra em inglês para poder ser entendida por um público maior. Então, thanks a lot, Lucile Martens, for accepting our invitation. Lucile Martens is a professor at the University of Lausanne. She took her PhD in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, as a dual degree from the University of Geneva and Sciences Po Paris. She received an award for her PhD thesis, and she has been doing lots of work on the environment as a political agenda within the United Nations, multilateralism, peacekeeping operations, and the environmental question. And today she's going to present a talk based on her last book, which is entitled Why International Organizations Hate Politics, the Case of the Environment at the United Nations. Lucile Martens, la parole est à vous.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you very much for your very kind invitation. I'm really pleased to be here today to present this work. So it's based on more than 10 years of research on different fieldwork, and I'm going to be talking about different topics about the environment, but also different organizations within the UN system. So let me first share my screen. Can you see properly? Yes. Okay, great. So the research that I'm going to be presenting today, so it's on the connection between international organization and depoliticization. And the example illustration that I'm going to be using are the case of the environment at the UN. But the book that Carlos was mentioning in introduction, which was co-written with Marie-Louise, is also addressing other topics within other organizations. So how did I start to look into this quite controversial topic, why international organizations hate politics? And these questions come from my fieldwork. So during the PhD, I was looking at the way the environment was framed as a security issue, so the securitization of the environment within the UN system. And I was embedded, so I did participant observation within the UN system, and I was 3 months within the UN Environment Program. And as a research assistant during this fieldwork, I kept hearing the people within UNEP saying that they were not doing politics. What they were doing, they say that they were proposing a neutral and science-based environmental assessment to determine the damage and risk. These are coming from my fieldworks. Another way to frame it is that one of my interviewees was telling me that UNEP is more accepted because it is less political. So during those 3 months, I kept on hearing this, that UNEP was not a political actor. And when I was looking at what UNEP was publishing in terms of report, the conclusions of the reports were actually pretty political. So this is an example taken from the report on Afghanistan. For the government of Afghanistan to address effectively the great environmental challenges faced by the country, strong and well-equipped environmental authorities are needed to guide and design new environmental management tools and policies, as well as monitor the implementation of protection and restoration projects. You can see in this quote, this is not apolitical. It's very political. It's about how do you equip your authorities and what type of power you can give them. Another example coming from the report on Sudan. Here are some of the recommendations that was at the end of the report. Invest in environmental management to support lasting peace in Darfur and to avoid local conflict over natural resources elsewhere in Sudan. And build capacity at all levels of government and improve legislation to ensure that reconstruction and economic development do not intensify environmental pressures and threaten the livelihoods of presence. Again, this is not apolitical. This is actually a very political message that UNEP is putting forward. And so based on this enigma, this was an empirical paradox that was coming from my fieldwork, I tried to understand this tension between the fact that international organization works on very political issues in very politicized contexts, but they still claim that they don't do politics. And this is actually something that is not common, not specific to the environment. This claim of apolitical nature of IOs can be found in many other cases, and that's how I also work with my colleague to do this comparison, to understand what we call this elephant in the room, because it's been said in many other scholarly work on IOs in the past that international organizations tend to present their work as apolitical, as technocratic. And so looking in those apolitical claims more seriously helps to have a better understanding of IO action, but also it's a way to expand depoliticization studies, because what we've been seeing in all the work that has been dedicated specifically to politicization and depoliticization is that this literature is mostly focusing on the national level. And so basically what we are doing in the book is a bit of a mix of these two books. On the one hand, you have this very classical book by Barnett and Fillmore, Rules for the World, where it's the sociology of international organization, trying to understand international organization as bureaucracies and especially the technocratic dimension. And on the other side, this work by Colin Hay, Why We Hate Politics, which brought back depoliticization. I'm saying brought back because depoliticization was part of political science for decades, but it's been more on the agenda of the discipline with his work, and that we took inspiration from his book for the title. So what I'm going to be presenting today is mainly based on this 3 publications, 2 articles on the case of UNEP, one in French, which is a comparison between UNEP and UNDP, where with Raphaël Parizet, we compare the way the UN Environment Programme and the UN Development Programme depoliticize. The second article in the middle, it's based on my work on the securitization of the environment, where I make the argument that depoliticization helps to securitize the environment, based again on the case of UNEP. And finally, why international organizations hate politics, depoliticizing the world. So I'm going to be presenting the framework that we designed in this book, and I'm going to be structuring my presentation based on the same structure. The book is available in open access, so you can consult it online and download the PDF if you're interested to know more. So what's the main question driving this research? So first, I'd like to say that it's not because I'm working on depoliticization that it's actually saying that international organizations are not politicized. It's quite the opposite. We see depoliticization as a political process. And so what we're trying to understand in this book is how, why, and to what end do IOs present their action as outside the realm of politics? Why do they say in interviews that they are not political and then publish reports where they are very political? And so more broadly, the question is how and why do IO perform depoliticization, and what are the consequences of IO depoliticizing moves? So this is different than the question, how IOs are political? Is IO action depoliticized? We're not able to give generic answers to those questions, because those questions are context specific. In some cases, IO action managed to become depoliticized, but this can only be assessed on a case-by-case basis. So the case of the environment at the UN, in terms of methodology, so it's the focus on this presentation, and I take example of the book as well. You can find other topics in the book, such as labor rights, development, humanitarian intervention. There's a different topic, international security, the Security Council. But today I'm going to present mostly on the case of the environment. The methodological approach is empirically driven. So as I opened the presentation, it came up from the field, it came up from this empirical question. It's based on participant observation within the United Nations, also semi-structured interviews and the analysis of UN productions, both in terms of content and format. And I'm insisting on that point because the format was especially one dimension that we thought was really interesting to understand depoliticization. It's a multiple case studies. I mentioned the case of UNEP, but actually there's different ways of addressing the case of the environment. I'm talking also about the environment and peacekeeping, but also about climate change negotiation. I'm going to present different cases. The idea is to have one framework, but to investigate different practices and logics in a variety of contexts. And so it's a twofold process. On the one hand, it's about the depoliticization of the role of UN programs and agencies in the field of environmental protection. And on the other hand, it's also the depoliticization of the environment within the UN. And so you will see that on the different cases, sometimes it's mostly focused on how one UN environmental organization managed to conceal its political nature, and on the other cases, it's more about how do you limit the political dimension of the debate around the environment. And so these questions about international organization and depoliticization, as I was saying earlier, it's not something that has not been addressed at all in the literature. It's, as I said, it was an elephant in the room. It's been in the literature, and we found three main trends where this question came up. So the first one is the functionalist debate. So basically, the literature, the functionalist literature, which is a mix of a literature on IOs, but also a political project, it's focusing on technocracy and peace. So this work is seeing politics, which is mostly state-centered, as negative. So there's a negative perception of politics, and so depoliticization is a condition for international cooperation. Functionalism has been criticized, improved, disproved, but what is interesting today, and that's why also we're saying about revisiting the functionalist debate, is that this idea that politics are bad, it's still very, very present in the way international organizations work, and especially how international civil servants see their work. And that we will see in different cases based also on interviews. And the second trend in the literature is the work on bureaucratic multilateralism, like I was saying with the work of Barnett and Fillmore, and the work on anti-politics and anti-politics machine. So all this work was showing that international organizations are bureaucratized, they manage global issues, and there is this strong criticism of IO apparent neutrality. What this work is showing is that depoliticization is a tactic to impose a specific worldview. And the third trend, the most recent one about expertise, knowledge production, and technicization is questioning the politics of expertise within international organization. And what they show is that there is a form of technicization and that is connecting to the organizational culture of IOs, and depoliticization is becoming a daily professional practice. So based on this, all this work that has been done already, we try to compile this different literature, but also go a bit beyond that by focusing on the concept of depoliticization. So bringing all this literature that has been mainly focused on the national level, like the work of Colin Hayes that I was mentioning, but also of Flinders and Wood. And then we applied depoliticization to the case of internationalization. So what is depoliticization? So in the book, we define depoliticization as a process that consists in minimizing, concealing, or in even eliminating politics within IOs. So that's where you see that it's a political process because it has political meaning and implication for international organization. And so more precisely, we see that this process is being enacted through daily practices and is following institutional logics and individual tactics. And this is very important that it's both institutional logic and individual tactics, because on the one hand, you had the bureaucratization literature that is focusing mostly on institutions, and then you have the politics of expertise, mostly looking at individual and professions. Here we're trying to make that and also to recognize, acknowledge the fact that it's not only strategic, it's also something that is rooted in the way internationalization work. And so the book is focusing on depoliticization, but that doesn't mean that there is no politicization within IOs. It's quite the opposite. It's for politicization and depoliticizations are happening at the same time, and they are both evidence of political agency of and within IOs. Like for us, it's all about the politics of depoliticization, the politics of IOs, and going into this specific window through the depoliticization is a way to improve our knowledge about IO politics. So how did we capture the politics of IO depoliticization? We proposed a twofold framework, which is the structure of the book. On the one hand, we defined the depoliticization practices, and in the second part, we defined depoliticization logics. So the practices is basically how do you internationalization depoliticize, and the logics is the why and to what end. So it's both the motives, the drivers, but as well the direction that is going. That's why it's not only intended, but also unintended consequences. So here is a summary, but I'm going to be presenting each of these practices and logics with example based on the case of the environment. So depoliticizing through which practices? So we define practices of depoliticization as socially meaningful patterns of action which deny or conceal contingency, choice, and deliberation. So it's because political debates are seen as detrimental to international cooperation and IO action that there is all those different practices through which international organizations try to depoliticize. So here are the three types of depoliticization practices. The first one is related to expertise, the second one to neutrality, and especially in terms of formatting. And the third one is connected to temporality and how you can play with time to depoliticize. So I will get straight to the example based on the environment. So one example that to start on the first practice, which is related to expertise, is how the UN Environment Programme, UNEP, is claiming its role as an expert. And there's different ways the UNEP is trying to build its expert profile. And building its expert profile help conceal the fact that working on different topics is actually quite a political decision. This is an interesting case because what you can see in this table is how UNEP managed to become an expert on the environment and security, despite the fact that security is not on its mandate. And so to build this expertise, UNEP built on different networks with external partners, and each partner was bringing legitimacy to UNEP as an expert in the security field. So here are different type of of partnerships. You don't need to see them into details, but what is interesting is how you build with in-house expertise, so with other UN bodies, basically, and you can find UN bodies that are working on different topics so that you can expand. Like if UNEP is working with UN Women, then it can claim an expertise also on gender issues, and it's a way to expand its work without admitting that it's a political decision to expand the mandate. The second one is about co-constructed IO expertise. It's when you're going to be trying to find other organizations, and then externally built expertise. That's something that is seen in many other organizations where you can find other like academic partners, for example, to build your expertise, your expert profile. And so with all of that, UNEP is claiming its expertise, and it's a way, again, to make this evolution of its mandate less political. Another example of this, the first type of practice related to expertise is how international organizations provide technical interpretation and solution. So basically how very political issues are reduced to technical problems. And again, I'm taking this case of UNEP. UNEP has been working at the field level since the end of the 1990s. It was not like something that was planned in its mandate, but it progressively went to the field to do post-conflict environmental assessment. And in the case of Colombia, it's interesting how UNEP is saying that is working on it's a technical recommendation, but at the same time they also do strategic environmental assessment, and they give advice on, and I'm quoting, measures to improve social, economic, and environmental condition, strengthening the institutional and technical capacities. So you see how you have a mix of something very technical, and at the same time, it's still a very political issues. So in this case, it's providing a technical interpretation of something that is actually very political. It's about how do you deal with the extractive sector, how do you deal with natural resources, how do you deal with the consequences, environmental consequences of the conflict in the region. And so, in other words, through technical environmental assessment, UNEP has established its role as a political advisor on key issues such as peace building, reform in the private sectors, or education. So it's based on this expertise that he managed to acquire this position of political advisor. So this first type of practices, we have identified two types in this expertise and technical interpretation. The first one is about claiming expertise, when international organizations portray themselves as neutral knowledge producers and holders. They use internal and external resources, scientific and legal knowledge and experience, and that has the consequences to isolate IOs from political debates by professing their value-free expertise. On the second column, it's the way our international organizations provide technical interpretation. So they interpret the world problem through technical understanding and solutions that they are mostly able to provide. The components of this type of practice is rational and evidence-based quantified instruments, technical assistance, and material support. And the mechanism at the end is that it's veiling global problems' political causes and conceals the influence and political direction of IO intervention. So now moving to the second type of practice, which is more related to less about the content of what the international organizations are producing and more about the format of these different products that we are being reading all the time in the news, but also on social media. And so I'm going to start with this example, which is taken from, again, UNEP, one of its reports on natural resources and conflict. And what is interesting with this debate, with this schematic pattern, with this figure, is that on the last column, it's about recommendation. So we can tell from the titles that it's supposed to be quite political, as if these ones were not political. Here you have the conflict cycle, which is a super simplified way to understand conflict, right? You have root causes, crisis, conflict, peace agreement, and then either peace or relapse into conflict. So it's a way to put a simplified understanding of how a conflict is working. And then here they add where natural resources can fit in. And this type of schematic patterns or graph, you can see them all the time in international organization reports. And what's the format of this is that it tends to depoliticize the content by presenting it as something just technical, again, something very based on evidence, and as if it was just informative and practical, something that was not up for debate. And so another example that I can mention is how international organization use online training platform. And in this case, so the first case is about the formatting. You use a specific format to make it look as neutral, as if it was not political, and as if it was simply the result of an evidence-based study. And another tactic that international organizations are using is not only about the format, but also about the dissemination practices. And this is the case with online training. So this online training, which was based on one of UNEP's reports on greening the blue helmets. So it was about the environmental footprint of peacekeeping mission, but as well on the link between natural resources and conflict. And in this type of module, and you have a lot of them online, what's interesting is that because it's an online module where it's not the international organization that is actually giving, it's taking the responsibility to implement what is in the online training. It's a reverse ownership. At the end of the day, the political decision to take the module, to implement the recommendation is on the trainee, it's not on the trainers. And you can see this type of audience-oriented format in many other type of what international organizations are producing. It could be guidelines, it could be also fact sheets, for example, where you can expect that it's the audience that is supposed to take the political responsibility to implement what is in the support. So the way the message is packaged with the online format is trying to decrease the political content. A last example is about good and best practices. So this is very interesting because everybody who has worked on international organization knows how IOs love to work with best practices. And what's interesting with best practices is that you cannot debate with a best practice. Best practices are based on lesson learned from the past. And because you can't debate with this as being a conclusion of we have experience, now we know this is the best practice, so now we need to implement. And this is a type of vehicles that also tend to depoliticize the content because you don't need to discuss the content anymore. It's been agreed on that now it's a best practice and that we should just implement it. And I think this example is quite interesting because this is taken from the Department of Field Support that was working on an environmental strategy for peacekeeping mission of the UN. So the peacekeeping mission of the UN have a pretty strong environmental footprint, and the UN Secretariat has been trying to reduce this environmental footprint. But there have been some backlash from several member states that are afraid that if you impose environmental standards, then it will have consequences on their ability to send their troops or their ability to sell their own material for the peacekeeping missions. So it's been quite a controversial topic. A way that the Secretariat is bypassing this controversy is by talking about good practices, because then again, we've experienced that in one mission. So in this mission, it was not so political. So we managed to do waste management. We managed to reduce our energy consumption. And then we're trying to put that in another mission to bypass the fact that some states are quite opposed to those different environmental or eco-friendly practices. So it's a way to, again, make it less political and to use the format in a way to depoliticize. So what we show in this chapter, so it's the second chapter that is based on this formatting neutrality, is that international organizations produce, support, circulate, and advise through neutrality. And so based on this different category, we identified how international organizations use, for example, generalization, simplification, but also informational and universal supports. Informational supports, like I was saying, with, for example, the online training, where you have also reverse ownership and proximity with the people. They use storytelling. When you use storytelling, that you talk about how some people have been like domestic workers, can explain how it was. Their experience as domestic workers was really difficult. How can you expect states then to oppose a treaty on domestic labor when you have the storytelling that is used during this type of negotiation, for example? And the last type of practice through neutrality is this type of best practices that I was mentioning. So at the end, what we see with those practices is that they reduce the political space for debate, they conceal the political dimension of the content, they displace political agency, and then disguise political advice and guidance. And so the third type of practices that I'm going to be talking about are practices related to time. And this is an example from the negotiation on the COP on climate change. So this is taken from the COP21 in Paris. COP26 has been postponed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Postponing is one of the practices that we identified as a depoliticization tactics within international organization. So how time plays a role. To politicize, you need political momentum. Losing political momentum is a way to depoliticize. And what we see in international organization is that you have different ways to make sure that political momentum is lost. And that doesn't mean it's not only international civil servants, it's also states, other members, IO partners. You have also different actors within international organization and within the UN system that are using these tactics. So in the case of climate change, what is interesting is how the complexification of the debates, the fact that now when you negotiate about climate change, you also negotiated about agriculture, about energy, about migration, about security, and adding all those different topics within the same negotiation makes it even more complex to negotiate. It dilutes the political content. It's less about just focusing on CO2 emission. It's also connecting to all the other issues that are related to climate change. And so all of this makes it like it's an ever increasing number of actors with contrasting interests. And so at the end, if nothing is agreed until everything is agreed on. And so this postpones the decision because it makes it more complex. So you have a dilution of the political content because of the complexification. Other example outside of the case of the environment is, for example, the reforms of different international organizations, such as the Security Council reform, which is very interesting how you have the compilation of different working groups, you have new reports, you always have these new committees. They are actually just reinventing the wheel because you have those debates since just the creation of the United Nations. But at the end of the day, by creating again and again these committees and having new reports, you piled up the different procedural and institutional practice, and this leads to the depoliticization of the debate. Another example about time and how this can dilute the political content is about discontinuity. So again, coming back to what I was saying at the very beginning of the presentation, what we are saying in the book is that it's not only we are not only talking about very strategic practices, it's also the way international organizations work. And this example is quite interesting. So this was a report where I was, when I was doing the participant observation within UNEP, UNEP was writing this report. And this report has been really a big challenge on the organization, because it was first not, it was ordered by the Secretariat General in New York, asking UNEP to do this study without checking first if they had financial and human resources. So they had to find the right department, and within the department, they had to find the right team. And then the person that was in charge had to move position, and then they hire someone else. And then you have all those back and forth between the different levels within the organization until the report is published. And what we can see from the very first draft of the report and at the end of the publication is that the publication at the end is much less politically contentious, but also less, the message is less political, because it's been through so many filters with all this discontinuity, that at the end of the day, this report, which is on livelihood security in the Sahel region, is, for example, much less on land ownership than what the others were intending at the beginning. So it's really interesting how the way international organizations also just tend to, because of all those steps that they have to go through to publish something, it dilutes the political content of what they are producing at the end. And so the different stages of those type of practices related to temporality, we identified 4 of them. So it's delaying practices, diluting practices, routinizing, and encouraging amnesia. So basically, it's how you postpone decision until you forget. And this is very interesting when you do, for example, interviews with newcomers within IOs about debates that have been going on for 50 years and that they actually don't know that it has been debated in the organization for years. And so just to, on this last column, it's interesting how you can just reset processes from the start by forgetting past political debates. And those are definitely part of all these depoliticization processes that we've been analyzing within different international organizations. And so now moving to the second part of the book, which is on the logics of depoliticization. What we are asking in this part is how we can understand the drivers of depoliticization, but also the concrete consequences for actors and issues at stake. So we chose to talk about logics instead of strategies, for example, because we think that logics encompass what support practices, because it gives them meaning and direction, but also comprise expectation, what actors could expect from those practices, and unintended consequences. And we identified 3 types of logic. The first one is the functional pragmatic path. The second one is about legitimacy and monopolization. And the third one is about responsibility. So like for the first part, I will dive into each part with example from the environmental field. So this example, again, coming from UNEP, is about how UNEP see depoliticization as the only way to access specific fields. And that's why it's connected to what we call the functional pragmatic path. It's because for the UN Environment Programme, the people working within UNEP, to access some of the places where they intervene, they needed to be seen as apolitical. It was the only way to be able to access those territories, and it was so depoliticization was just a necessity, and it was seen as the only way to make sure that UNEP will be able to fulfill its mandate of environmental protection. In the case of the environment, what is interesting is that it's also the environment by itself that is seen as a platform for cooperation, an apolitical platform for cooperation. And that's also why it's connected to this pragmatism. Here I'm going to take another example based on peacekeeping. So this example is from the MINUSTA, so the peacekeeping mission that was in Haiti. When the MINUSTA arrived, they tried to do a program of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration with what they were doing in other mission. In other mission, they were doing that with ex-combatants, but when they came to Haiti, they realized that it did not work because it was not exactly the same type of conflict. What they came up with is doing community violence reduction, CVR program. They wanted to make sure that they can use, instead of doing disarmament, trying to find ways to reduce the violence among community. And why the environment is interesting here is that because they use, and I quote an interview, that they use the environment as a pacification tool. So in this case, it's interesting because the environment was seen as a platform to reduce violence between communities, because first, they will bring gang members from different gangs together to work together on environmental rehabilitation programs. Working together will be a way for them to socialize and to be able to be more, maybe even like create bonds between each other. It will also bring some money to those people so that they won't then do illicit activities. They would be tired of their day. So that was an interesting element that was coming up also in interviews. And they would participate in something that would be useful for society overall. And so basically here, what you've seen is that how the environment was seen as something very pragmatic, where you can make people work together, people that don't get along, that usually are violent, and that's how it was presented, and that's how they could work together. So in this case, it's really about being pragmatic. So what in terms of logic, so we've seen two different types of logic in this example. The first one is about functional necessity. International organizations need to achieve their mandates. They want to answer people's needs. They want to obtain state permission. But at the end of the day, it also leads to a fragmentation within the international system. The second dimension is about being practical, the practical rationality. It's pragmatic problem solving. You need to bypass controversies. You want to facilitate cooperation. But at the end of the day, it's also stigmatized politics. So this is the first type of logic that we've identified. The second one is related to legitimacy. And there is different ways where this connects to depoliticization and legitimacy. And the first one is how you use international organizations reinvest their old skills to preserve their relevance. And here I took two examples, but there's many other ones. On the first one is about the IOM, the International Organization for Migration, or for UN Migration as well, and how the IOM managed to connect its own mandate to climate change, because reinvesting all skill on migration. And the second one is about how the ILO has been working on their environment based on green jobs. So you can see how each organization managed to find a way to reconnect to important topics to stay relevant. And I think we can say now with the COVID-19, for example, we've seen many organizations trying to find ways to connect their own core business with health issues or with the pandemic. There's always a connection to make. And this is a way to expand and to keep the legitimacy of an organization or even to expand it. And here, in terms of expansion, I can mention the case of the UNHCR, so the UN Refugee Agency, which has been working on the protection of disaster, of victims of natural disasters, and the way that the organization has been justifying this intervention is because of institutional gaps. So basically, the organization managed to make it look like it was not a political decision to work on something else than refugees, but it was just because there was an institutional gaps and because of its experience, of its capabilities, they should be the one working on natural disasters. A last example about legitimacy and depoliticization is when you have an organization that has a monopoly over one field of like a thematic field or a policy field, it's really difficult for another organization to invent in this, to work on this field. And the case of the UN Climate Change Convention is quite interesting, how it has been used as a way to exclude other actors within the UN system. And then I'm going to take this example from a debate that has been held in the UN Security Council in 2019, where the Indian delegate said, and I'm reading the quote, "Can the needs of climate justice be served by shifting climate lawmaking from the inclusive United Nations Frameworks Convention on Climate Change to decision-making by a structurally unrepresentative organization? The disruptive spillover of such a change made through a mere decision of the Council on the UNFCCC processes and the Paris Agreement, as well as on the other multilateral organs currently engaged in cooperatively tackling climate change, and indeed on multilateral lawmaking, is real." So the argument here, you have many countries that have been pushing since 2007 to put climate change on the agenda of the Security Council. What they are saying is that it's important that the Security Council recognize that climate change is a security issue and that it should be taken into account. What India is saying in this quote is that it should not be the UN Security Council because the main body that is in charge of climate change is the UNFCCC. And why we should change that and go to, and I'm quoting, a structurally unrepresentative organization. And that's true, the UN Security Council is not universal, contrary to the UNFCCC. But it's interesting how this fragmentation of the system is used to leave the climate change as a less political issue, because we know that the Security Council is where we talk about the very political issues. So how the fragmentation is also creating monopoly on specific topics that also lead to more depoliticization. So here's a summary of this logic, where you have a logic of recognition, a logic of expansion, and a logic of monopolization, where basically international organizations try to avoid competition, reinvest all skills, they claim necessity, they project expertise, they profess technical requirements, they proclaim the one best way, and at the end of the day, that allows them to expand their mandate to monopolize a field of expertise, and at the end, this monopoly reinforces depoliticization. And so I'm going to be talking now about the last logic before concluding this presentation. So the last logic is about responsibility, the link between depoliticization and responsibility. So what we've found in looking into all those different cases within different international organizations is that depoliticization also follows a logic of displacing responsibility. It's about finding someone else that is responsible. And this example is quite interesting about how this process of finding a scapegoat. So Eric Solheim, which was the executive director of the UN Environment Program, has been asked to resign especially because of his the way he's been traveling too much and how his carbon emissions were too high for head of agency that is dedicated to the protection of the environment. This argument is fair that the head of UNEP should not be traveling so much. But what is interesting is how the debate was only about his own travel. It didn't lead to like a major discussion about how other UN workers are traveling. Why is it makes sense to have the UN Environment Program still in Nairobi, where you have all the other UN bodies in Geneva and New York, and it's really difficult from Nairobi to actually do the same work that you can do in Geneva or New York. Do we want to have other UN bodies or very big decision-making places outside of New York and Geneva, for example, and make sure that UNEP could still do its work from Nairobi by having other organizations there? Everything was about his own footprint. It was not about the general system that led to this situation. Another example of how you can try to find responsibility somewhere else is the case of the MINUSTAH again, and how the MINUSTAH brought the cholera pandemic in Haiti. The way the UN refused to admit its responsibility in bringing the pandemic in Haiti was really interesting, because at first they said that it was a confluence of different causes that could explain. So it was not the fact that there was a contingent coming from Nepal with the disease, and the fact that the camp did not respect the environmental management guidelines about wastewater. It was about the fact that within Haiti, it's very difficult to recycle the water. So basically, it was not about the whole system of very unequal share of responsibilities within the UN peacekeeping system. It was mostly about the local conditions. And a final example about how you can displace responsibility, or at least find a way to disengage from political debates, is how the environment and climate change has been used as an excuse to displace political responsibility. And this was the case about the case of the conflict in Darfur. And then I'm going to be just summarizing this quote by the Sudanese delegate at the UN Security Council, where basically Sudan was saying that the cause of the conflict in Darfur was climate change. And so what does it mean? It means that it's not the responsibility of Khartoum. It's you naturalize the conflict. It's about asserting that the main cause in Darfur was desertification and drought, as if first the government was not responsible for the way that water resources are shared in the country, and about all the other activities that have been doing in the conflict. So it's a way, again, to push away responsibility by depoliticizing the conflict. So to summarize this slice logic, it's about delimiting politics and displacing responsibility. There's different ways international organizations challenge responsibility attribution. They find strategies of blame shifting. And at the end of the day, this also participates in maintaining the status quo with the reproduction of existing power relationships. So to conclude, what about politics? So I've been talking about depoliticization during this presentation. So in the case of the environment, what is interesting is how the environment is has been framed as a technical question, as if it is not controversial. It's a universal problem, and environmental actors have been engaged on the basis of their neutral expertise. Basically, the environment is replacing politics. And is it always the case? Of course not. Politicization, depoliticization, and repoliticizations are coming all at the same time within international organization. The focus of the books and the articles are precisely on depoliticization, but what we show in the conclusion is that we see already that there is contestation, resistance, even signs of counterproductive depoliticization. But at the end of the day, it's all about political action of IOs. It's like the politics of IOs can happen with politicization or depoliticization. In terms of contestation and resistance, I'm just going to briefly mention a case of against of UNEP and its work in Haiti. And the most recent work of UNEP in Haiti on deforestation, for example, was trying to repoliticize the causes of deforestation. It's trying to go against a depoliticized reading of the situation. And you can see how dedicated staff can also like contest, resist depoliticization. But depoliticization is a recurring backdrop within different international organizations. And so what can we learn from this? So the book is a systematic analysis of what we can see a very common question in IO studies. It brings a twofold framework with the practices and the logics. And the idea of the book was also to diffuse work that has been done in the French-speaking academia. There's been a lot of work on international organization. Some of them has not been translated, and it was really important for us to make sure that it was disseminated. And we hope that now we can further develop have further development about international organization and processes of depoliticization. So what can we learn about this, the success of depoliticization? What we can say is that it really needs to be recontextualized in some cases, and that's what we try to do in the book, is not to overgeneralize what is happening in terms of effects, because it's really context dependent. But what we can see is that there is a tension between this legitimacy quest of international organization and the fact that they avoid responsibility. And that's interesting with all this now the very the populist discourse against international organization. We could question how this depoliticization practices and logics do not feed actually this discredit of international organization, and how it's important to study these processes also in terms of politically relevance. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Merci, Lucile. Thanks a lot for your presentation. It was excellent. I'm going to ask my colleagues if they have questions, if they want to raise their hands. While they do that, I'm going to make 2 or 3 comments. I see that Monica has already a question. My comments are the following, Lucile. I remembered a lot my own experience as an international civil servant for 8 years at UNESCO, where we were asked by state representatives to be an honest broker, that we were there working on consensus building. And it was always, of course, in the middle or in between politicization and depoliticization. And I am not 100% sure if I really understand the differences and the similarities that there may be between one and the other. It seems to me that politicization and depoliticization are both part of the same continuum, which is the kind of political action that international intergovernmental organizations actually practice. An example that I remember when I was working at UNESCO, all the environmental programs, they were dealing with forest management, risks of desertification, and there was not a single program implemented by UNESCO dealing with consumption patterns and lifestyles. Because these were considered, when I started talking about them as a very young international civil servant at the time, good old days, my colleagues, German colleagues, Finnish colleagues, mainly European colleagues, they will always say, oh, Carlos, you want to politicize the subjects. So, well, but you are not putting one side of the politics on the agenda. Then you are also doing it. That's why I'm just wondering how you can really capture the differences between one and the other, because at the same time you are depoliticizing, you are doing politics. If you could just explain that a little bit more conceptually speaking. A second comment just piggybacks on what you said at the very end, that perhaps these trends, this kind of modality of action of international organizations may, at the end of the day, support the emergence of climate change denial, climate change obstruction politics. And particularly in authoritarian contexts, what some people prefer to call populist, I prefer to call them authoritarian contexts, right? And I think that perhaps this is one of the major risks of this kind of modality of action or political action of international organizations, that at the end of the day, because they are technocratizing all the scores, the narratives, and the types of actions, then they may, at the end of the day, support the emergence of passionate politics. It may be negative passion, but it comes with passion, because with what all these people and agents of climate change denial and delay politics and obstruction politics are doing, they are doing with lots of passion. Right, and perhaps the international organizations, they have contributed to render passionate politics a sin. But can you actually do politics without passion? And then I mean I come back to the role of international organizations, and that's it. These are my two comments, and I give the floor to Monica, and then I see Mauricio Domingues, who has also raised his hand. I'm going to pick up three commentators' questions, and then I'll give the floor back to you, right, Lucile?
Okay, well, nice to meet you, and I really enjoyed your presentation, Lucile. I found it very, very interesting and creative in certain aspects. I really enjoyed your controversies put to the question of good practices. I thought that's very interesting, and the whole idea that they exist for non-contestation. No, that's very important. But I wanted to try to fit in a more realistic approach to your presentation and work, and having to do with power politics and how, because you haven't, well, except for mentioning the Indians in at the Security Council, I mean, states did not exist in your presentation. And I usually see states as, let's put it, backseat drivers of international organizations. And not only because of the funding, but also because of the power politics that goes on inside IO. So I just wonder, and of course, it has an enormous influence, I would say, upon the question of depoliticization. So I would just like to know, where is it? Or is there a place for power politics? We have a poem in Brazil, there's a stone in the middle, no? And so power politics is a stone in the middle for the whole debate and the whole possibility of neutrality and depoliticization, as Carlos was putting it. And also, and I'll give you a very clear example. You mentioned a lot Haiti and all the efforts that were done there. And well, I've done a lot of work on Haiti as well. And what you described was a lot of what Viva Rio, which is a Brazilian NGO, was doing there, right? I saw it in your description. But Viva Rio was there because of a bilateral negotiation with Brazilian military. So, I mean, there was a lot of power politics there as well. Neutralization and stabilization of the situation in Haiti went along. It was the hard part. I mean, it was the hard power dimension of let's put it, the soft power efforts and initiatives Viva Rio was doing. So I think it's I find it very difficult to really dissociate the real world of politics and power, which have a lot of influence upon IOs, unfortunately, but that's I wonder what would be your impression on that. Thank you.
Lucile, can I take another question? Is that okay? Okay, José Mauricio, and then I give it back to you, right, Lucile?
I forgot to switch on my mic. Thank you very much for your talk, Lucile. I happen to have read a large bunch of your book and some of your articles as well. Also because I'm interested. Well, we taught a class together, me and Carlos Milani, and then we had a piece of yours in the reading list. And I went after your other articles, and the book came out recently, right? Which is very interesting. I mean, you just reaffirmed that now. I'm reading that also because you're interested in climate change and how international organizations deal with that. But I was a bit surprised when you said that sort of these agents you're talking about, it's as if they were disguising their political role. You actually said that now, and I hadn't read your book and the articles in this way. I would think of that more as ideology, right? These international organizations have an ideology that supposes that they don't have a political behavior. While, of course, states and other agents do have a more clear sort of political behavior. So that's a very direct and simple question, which I would like to ask you, but I think it's very important for the thrust of the argument, because of course, I'm sure that a lot of people in these organizations are pretty cynical. They know what they're doing, and they pretend they are not doing that. They know they are doing politics, but they pretend they are not doing politics. But that can be the frame of mind and mindset all the time, because otherwise cynicism has some limits, right? So I would like to hear about that from you. Thank you.
Bon courage, Lucile.
Thanks a lot for these very rich questions, and I hope I will raise to the challenge of answering them in all of them, I would say. So I will go in order, but even though they are quite connected, especially the first one of Carlos and what Monica has been saying about states. So it's so maybe just about this continuum of political work. We completely agree on that, Carlos. It's actually why I really see the work that has been done on politicization within international organization. And I'm thinking, for example, of the recent book by Frédéric Méran. So the French version has been out, and the English version is going to be out in the next few months. On it's a political ethnography of the European Commission, and it looks exactly at how within the European Commission some actors are trying to politicize. And what we do in the book is how we look into some actors trying to depoliticize. But that doesn't mean that they don't work together. It's actually quite the opposite. You have this tension all the time. It's just because there have been so many instances where you talk about technocracy within international organization, that we've talked about these different ways of bypassing politics, that we wanted to dedicate one entire book on this specific types of depoliticization within IOs, but that doesn't mean that it's not attention. And I think it would be like the next step would be actually to try to see how they work together. Is because we wanted to have so many cases in the book. The book is structured based on practices and logic. It's not, here I focused only on the environment, but you have many, many other cases in the book. And so that's how we found this this running like main common questions across different organizations. But I completely agree that it's a continuum, and what can be seen as depoliticization for one actor can be seen as politicization by the other. So that's why it also needs to be context specific, that you need to understand there's those different practices, and it's just tools to help you see how depoliticization works is at work in practice, but that doesn't mean that it's always seen as depoliticization. And that's also why we prefer talking about logics instead of intentions, because most of the time it's really hard also to pinpoint intentions. Like it's, even in interviews, people can tell you that they did that for that, but that doesn't mean that they actually did that for that, right? So talking about logics, trying to understand how it works hand in hand with organizational culture, professional habits, institutional constraints, makes it more like a general process of how international organization work. And so it's really difficult what you were saying about how to capture these differences, and my answer will be it's context specific. Like in some instances it will be seen as depoliticization, and for other politicization. But what we try to see is to identify those different practices and how they can make sense outside of their of the cases that were identified, like the one on the environment. So depoliticizing is doing politics. Like that's exactly what we're trying to say. It's not depoliticization is part of IO politics, and it needs to be addressed as much as other type of practices. This being said, I think I'm going to be talking more about connecting to Monica, and then I will be going back to your second question, because yeah, my presentation was talking much less about states. But the states are all over the book, because what we decided to do is not to talk only about international organization as international civil servant, but also about how states are behaving within IOs. And that's what's interesting, is that we can, like the literature on depoliticization tend to say that basically technocrats and civil society, technocrats depoliticize, states are power politics, and civil society try to repoliticize. And what we see in the book is that all of these actors can participate in depoliticization. You have civil society, you have NGOs depoliticizing, you have like labor unions depoliticizing, for example, but you have states depoliticizing. And I think in the temporality chapter is very like strong, especially in the case of climate change, how all the postponing negotiation, this is states politics, trying to postpone, dilute political momentum. That's states politics, that's states deciding not to take decision at one time. And so that's why power is there, and that's why it's still political. Like depoliticization is a political process, it's a political act, and I think it was not maybe not put enough in the presentation, but that's definitely here, and I completely agree. And the case of Viva Rio is very interesting, how they actually brought the NGO to come up with this, because they were like the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration program was a big failure after 1 year. So they decided to, as you said, it was a bilateral decision. It was discussion between the mission and the Brazilian government, and they brought this NGO coming up with this with this new like concept of CVR, community violence reduction. That it was first in Haiti, and now it's most of the missions. And again, it's like we forget the political history of bringing this in Haiti and what it means politically to change. What do we see? What do we mean about what's community violence? So, and it's interesting how they fragmented the responsibility, where you have UNDP doing the rural areas, and then you have the peacekeeping mission doing the urban areas. And here again, it's a way to splitting responsibilities and making look as if it was not a political decision. It was made step by step, and then everybody is fine in their own, you know, subtopic. So I think it's very interesting what we were saying, and neutrality as being, you said, being realistic approach. I think here it's actually trying to show that the states are being realistic is also depoliticizing topics when they don't want to deal with them. And the responsibility on the cholera was also a good example of how finding a way to not recognize the responsibility. Going back to, is this depoliticization can support climate deniers, and how can we do politics without passion? This is really an interesting question, because we struggle with one aspect about the stigmatization of politics. In a way, what we've seen is how by keep on saying that politics are not good, yeah, that's all good. So there is a form of stigmatization of politics. And it's interesting how diplomats can resist that as well. We put that also in the conclusion. Like some diplomats saying, no, I'm not a technocrat. I'm doing politics. Politics is the better good. It's about dealing about the city. It's thinking about the society. Politics is not bad. And in the book, what we're trying to do is not to actually say that politics is bad. It's about thinking about the different processes where you have room for debate, the definition of politics as a struggle or conflict, but politics as debate and choice. And that's why we focus on contingency, thinking about politics as something also that can be inherently positive. And depoliticization is not politicization is not only about democracy, and depoliticization can also be part of the debate. But politics is about having the choice and being able to discuss, basically. And when you avoid, like you conceal contingency because you think that this decision is there for a reason, and you can't debate anymore, that's where you have depoliticization at play. And the final question about this the cynical view on a civil servant, and they know what they're doing or they don't know what they're doing. I think it's again, it's really case specific. It's interesting in interviews when you, for example, the case that I know best of the link between conflict and the environment. This was really interesting talk that I had with some people working in different international organizations, where I was trying to explain that if you focus too much on like natural causes of conflicts, you tend to depoliticize the conflict, and you tend to like conceal the political responsibility. And this was coming as a surprise for some of those actors, saying, yeah, but we just wanted to show that there is a link between natural resources and conflict. So, yes, sure, there is a link. But if you focus too much on this link, then you forget about politics and how political actors are responsible in those conflicts. So I would say that it really depends. I have to say that in some of those actors that I met were really strongly believing on the functionalist narrative was still very strong in their mind. But some others were also being just pragmatic about how they have to do their work. And as Carlos was saying, that you have big tension on a daily basis, and you, at the end of the day, you need to fulfill what the mandate. So it's also about being sure that you manage to make the job happen, right?
Thanks, Lucile. Now we have one question from Leticia. Leticia, please.
Thank you, Carlos. Thank you very much, Lucile. It was a very interesting presentation. Well, I might not have followed all your arguments completely, entirely, that's the bad news. But the good news is that I am very much interested in reading your book and to get this whole argument. I have two questions. That the first one, I think, goes something similar or on the same line as Monica's question. I wonder how much depoliticization, or the purpose of the depoliticization is more successful, or might be more successful, if and when the IO's action is, or when the IOs are in action in less developed or less powerful countries. So the narrative or the discourse or the practice less politicized is easier to implement if you are dealing with countries with less powerful to contest or to resist or to make any opposition to the kind of technocrat or no politicized attitudes. And my second question is, if you also have examined the internal politics, that is a kind of politicization process or a depoliticization process within the IOs. Because when Carlos mentioned his experience at UNESCO, it seems that very clear that they are between bureaucrats, and also between bureaucrats and diplomats might have a lot of political fights and competition and disagreements. So that's it. Thank you very much. Was very, very interesting.
Thanks a lot, Laetitia. So should I take another one?
Let's see. I just have one comment here by Maria Regina. She says, I don't know if she wants to speak out. She says on the chat, depoliticization as technocratization is the opposite of denial, which is denying the denial of science and the creation of fake news. I don't know if Regina wants to comment on that, or you can just react if you want, Lucile.
No, just want to know from your perspective, what is the relationship between depoliticization and negationism as opposites?
Denial.
Yes. Denial.
Yeah.
They are both bad for democracy.
Thank you very much for the different questions. So going back to the two questions by Laetitia, thank you. So this is very interesting. Well, the first one about the implementation and the success of depoliticization, and how if we talk about especially like implementing policies at the local level, and if it's connected to less powerful countries. Again, this depending on the case. I can mention one case that has been studied by Rafael Parizet. She worked on UNDP in Mexico, and she worked on how the UNDP like agreed basically on the official national discourse on indigenous peoples in Mexico, and depoliticize the whole debate about sorry, the French words are coming in. Indigenous people in Mexico, and how they tried to make it look like it was a political debate. So, for example, UNDP organized different meetings where they were asking different NGOs to come, but they pick up the NGOs that were having the same discourse at the national countries. So again, it's here in this case, it's for sure that indigenous peoples with less power were not able to fight the depoliticization of UNDP as much as other organizations would have been able to. So I think it's quite an important criteria to look at, depending again case by case. But I think you're right. But there is resistance in different ways taking place. But it's probably easier to when actors that want issues to be politicized, if they are less powerful, it's probably easier for the IO to manage to keep it concealed or less controversial. And in this case, that was the result. In terms of internal politics, that's completely what we look at. There is lots of debate between bureaucrats. I think there's one very interesting case in the debate within the World Bank, for example, when you have different types of professions, or within the WHO, where you have different type of expertise, where you have opposition between experts, and at the end it's a fight between experts, but one of them managed to win and to make it their own in terms of framing. So I completely agree. There is fight, disagreement, competition, and you can see that some departments are winning over the others, and that's where depoliticization might turn to be useful to win in some cases, and on the other one, it's actually power politics coming back. And very briefly on the other question about depoliticization and denial, it's interesting because you could, I mean, it's part of the connection between technicization and science. I think one interesting way I would say to think out of the box is about the pluralization of knowledge. And in the case of the environment, is very interesting because the tension is that international organization needs to promote science. They need to make sure that we have science-based decision to protect the environment, but they need to do that without depoliticizing, because otherwise they can actually have the backlash that we were talking about. And one way, and this is what has been a bit doing, at least on the biodiversity side, is trying to pluralize knowledge, saying science, it's not only about models, it's about different ways of producing knowledge about the world and making sure that all those different types of knowledge are connected with each other. And I think that's a good way forward to think about, make sure that we knowledge, but we don't depoliticize, by also acknowledging that knowledge production is a political issue. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, Lucile, I agree with you on this specific topic, because I think that as far as climate change is concerned, what the United Nations has built is a very expert-based system in which only climate sciences, I mean, very rarely social scientists are called upon to say what climate change means. And actually this narrative of climate change and the threats of climate change and the challenges that it represents to all of us as countries, as nations, as individuals, as societies, as humanity, I mean, this narrative has not trickled down, and it has not been fed by other visions of development, other development models. For example, we keep and we insist on talking about energy transitions, but it's not only about energy transition. It's another eco-social vision that you may have of development, but we don't talk about this because perhaps it is too political. And then at the end of the day, you end up perhaps technocratizing science and depoliticizing the debate in a very risky way. And then climate denial emerges as I mean, a form of contestation, of course. Well, we don't have any more questions from our audience. I'd like to thank you a lot, Lucile. This has just been a first opportunity for us to dialogue. I am sure that we are going to have other opportunities and initiatives. And I'd like to thank all my colleagues who are present here, all the audience who have followed us on the YouTube. And that's it. Thank you so much, Lucile. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much for the invitation and very important questions.